In January, I asked people if they wanted to share any children's folklore as part of my February theme. As a branch of study, children's folklore largely refers to folklore that is created, shared and maintained by children. So contributors could share folklore they remembered from their childhood, or they could share what they'd heard from children in their lives now. We've already looked at urban legends and children's beliefs, and this time we're going to focus on childhood games. So what did listeners play as children both in the schoolyard and at home? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I do hope that you're well. I do hope that February has been good to you in some shape or form. Like I said in the introduction, we're going to have a look at children's games in this episode, and I did get an awful lot of responses related to stuff to do with games, and some of them were incredibly extensive. But some of them I haven't included everything that was submitted because where things were incomplete, it didn't really seem right to put those in, particularly when I had so much other content that was complete. So I've tried to divide it into types of games and things like that, just, so there's plenty of content in here. But there won't really be a huge amount of analysis from me in this one, or indeed commentary from me. I'm basically just sharing what people shared with me. That's mostly because of the fact that where the games are concerned, a lot of them sort of speak for themselves. And what I'm more interested in is, did anybody else play something similar? Does anyone remember any of these? Does anyone remember different versions of these? Things like that. So this one's probably going to be more a matter of triggering your own memory about things you used to play as children. So if any of these suddenly make you go, oh my God, we did that, please feel free to let me know. Or if you had a version of something, let me know. There's a couple to start off with which are crazes that went round schools, and it would be quite interesting to hear how many other schools this same or a similar craze went round. So this one's going to be more just sharing some of the really cool stuff that people came up with, because some of it is really inventive, much like the beliefs one. So hopefully you'll enjoy this. But I did mention crazes, so we will start with those. And Kim from Saltburn by the Sea shared a story that went round her school, Newmask Primary School, around 2006. So as Kim says, and I quote, "It went round our school that if you sat in a circle, closed your eyes and chanted the phrase, 'Devil, devil, scratch my back,' it was repeated at least 3 times, but I'm unsure how many, the devil would come and touch one of you, leaving red scratches down your back. Afterwards, the kids would lift up the back of their t-shirts and check for marks, and one kid would always have them. I played once and received red welts, although I wasn't touched. It was possibly the heat. This game was played obsessively for about 2 weeks one summer and then vanished entirely." End quote. I do like that one because it demonstrates the fad nature of children, that something can be the flavour of the week at one point and then just completely forgotten, and nobody knows why it catches on in the first place, or indeed why it loses favour. It just kind of comes and goes, and it's quite interesting how that works. And there was a similar one here from Georgia from Torquay in Devon, who shared a craze that went round her secondary school in the early 1990s. So as Georgia says, and I quote, "There was this weird craze, and I mean weird, where one person would stand with their back to a wall, bend over, and intentionally hyperventilate for a minute, and then stand up suddenly against the wall. Then a group of 3 or more people would push hard on their chest until that person passed out. Sometimes you'd get all sorts of crazy hallucinations. The kids said it was basically like being dead for a few seconds because it stopped your heart, and that's why you got hallucinations. I have no idea where it came from or whether other schools had the craze." End quote. I'm really glad that one didn't go around my school in Newcastle, because that actually sounds really quite unpleasant. But it would be really interesting to know if other schools had the same craze or something similar, much like the devil game as well. And these kind of crazes do seem like fads that appear from nowhere and then pass really quickly. And I can't help thinking the TikTok trends have probably replaced these much more location-based crazes from earlier decades because of the homogenizing nature of social media. So rather than something being a thing that's practiced in one single school, it then ends up being all kids everywhere do it because they've seen it online. which I don't necessarily know is that helpful. It's certainly a bit of a pain if you're a folklorist, but there we go. We're going to move on to playground games, and these ones differ from the Crazes because they do seem to have had much more intention and longevity behind them, and in some cases there's variations have been reported of the same game in different places, so these ones are obviously like the classics, as it were, when it comes to playing things in the playground. Jimmy Wim from East Lothian, Scotland reported these two playground games. So, and I quote, "What's the time, Mr. Wolf?" where one person would stand with their back to the rest would say, "What's the time, Mr. Wolf?" Mr. Wolf would reply, for example, 3 o'clock, and the rest would take 3 steps forward. At a random moment, Mr. Wolf would turn around and try to grab anyone, who would then become Mr. Wolf. We also played cops and robbers. There was a corner of the playground which had a door into the boiler room, and there was a step down, so it was a 2 metre or so square. That was jail. Folk would somehow divide up into cops and robbers. Cops had to chase robbers who would then escort them into jail. At a certain point, when enough robbers were in jail, there'd be a jailbreak where all the robbers would try to run out of jail and the coppers had to stop them. I'm not sure if there was an end game. The bell always rang and we had to go back inside, end quote. I quite like that you just keep playing it until the bell rings. That's quite funny. Helen from Sheffield also mentioned the Mr. Wolf game, and Rachel from Essex remembered a variation on it, as well as playing games inspired by Star Wars. But the variation that Rachel gave runs, and I quote, "We played a lot of games based on our names. I remember one in particular where one child was the caller and the other children were the players. The caller would turn their back to us and call out letters. If we had that letter in our name, we could move forward 1 step, 2 if you had that letter twice, etc. It was similar to the game What's the Time, Mr. Wolf, where the caller called out random numbers instead of letters. In each game, when you reached the caller, you were supposed to grab or hug them," end quote. So that's quite interesting, that it was kind of more a question of you had to get closer to the caller rather than you potentially being in their way. So that was an interesting variation. James from Lancashire reported this separate game from primary school in the mid-1990s. I quote, "It was a game called Fog Monster based on how our school fields sometimes had low fog that made visibility difficult. In my memory it was completely thick and obscured everything, but in reality it was probably less dramatic. The game was simply to announce, 'I'm going to get the fog monster,' and walk into the fog a little way before shouting, 'The fog monster's coming,' and the whole group would run across the playground as fast as possible. It was less a game than a little imaginary play, I guess, where the main aim was to freak each other out with the idea of the fog monster," end quote. I quite like that one because it almost takes us back to some of the urban legend / belief type things, but at the same time using atmospheric conditions to turn it into a game. James did also report that he invented the game with his brother and a few friends, and once it spread, and I quote, "I remember seeing a group of other children playing this game and being annoyed that they'd copied our game," end quote. I thought that was quite funny. Damien from Tala in Dublin remembered a game during the 1970s and 1980s called Root the Boot, and I quote, "It involved a circle of boys with a coin in the centre. Anyone who dared enter the circle to grab the coin or was pushed into the circle got an absolute kicking. Weirdly, nobody has heard of this game anywhere else when I mention it," end quote. So if you've heard of it, please do feel free to let me know. Harriet from London remembered a game played in around 1972, and I quote, "You had to chant the following whilst bouncing a ball against a wall and doing the movements in the rhyme. If you dropped the ball, you were out. Oliver Twist can't do this, so what's the use of trying? Number 1, touch your thumb. Number 2, touch your shoe. Number 3, touch your knee. Number 4, touch the floor. Number 5, jump up high. Number 6, pick up sticks. Number 7, pray to heaven. Number 8, jump the gate. Number 9, touch your spine. Number 10, begin again," end quote. And Harriet also recalled, and I quote, "We used to play jacks a lot, and I can remember playing British Bulldog on my first day at primary school in the UK in about 1969. The other playground games I can remember are It, Granny's Footsteps, and What's the Time, Mr. Wolf. There was a phase when kids shouted out, 'Georgie Best lives in the West and he wears a vest,' end quote. And several people did actually report British Bulldogs. Helen from Sheffield remembered that it got banned because too many people got hurt, and I didn't remember it at all, so I have no idea what that is or how people play it. Maybe people played it at school and I just didn't pay attention, which is possible. But Jimmy Wim from East Lothian gave a fuller account of how it was played, and I quote, "This one is probably a bit more universal. I think most school kids know British Bulldog, where 2 teams of kids at opposite ends of a playing field had to barge their way to the other side without getting beat up in the melee in the middle, end quote. Like I say, I literally do not remember that one. So Brittany in Alma, Arkansas remembered, and I quote, "We played this weird version of tag called colour tag where you got chased, and if you got caught you had to say a colour without repeating one another kid had already used, and then you got to do the chasing. I think that's how it worked anyway. Eventually we would get down to shades, so like baby blue and hot pink, and inevitably clear. This was around 1991, end quote." I like that. You do think, actually, there are a lot of weird colour names that you don't remember until you absolutely need to, so it'd be interesting to see how far people got with that. And Helen from Sheffield also reported the game Tick. In it, someone was considered it or the tick, and everyone else ran away. The person designated the tick had to catch up with someone and touch them, which then made them the tick. If you try to tag the person who tagged you, they would say, "Can't tick you butcher." Off-ground tick was a variation in which you couldn't be tagged if you stood on a step, a wall or a manhole cover, basically something that wasn't the ground, and apparently that led to arguments about what counted as being off the ground. And Helen also remembered stuck in the mud, in which those who were tagged had to stand with their legs apart once caught, and another player could free them by crawling through their legs. And the tagger's objective in that game was to tag everyone, and as Helen said, and I quote, "It was easy to tick someone that was freeing someone else," end quote. We had a version of that. It wasn't called that though. Ours was basically how we played dodgeball. So if you got hit by the ball, you then had to stand there sort of like with your arms out and your legs wide. And then another player would then have to crawl between your legs to unfreeze you. So again, obviously, if you had any kind of sense and you had the ball, you would just keep throwing it at the people who were crawling through people's legs. I can't remember if they had to then stop where they were or if they were allowed to continue crawling out and then had to stand still. But that's how we played dodgeball. So I don't know. That's very, very different, I think, from the dodgeball that you see elsewhere. But that's how we did it in Newcastle, at least at my school anyway. Of course, not all games were designed for the playground, and children often invented their own games to be played with neighbourhood friends. So Tracy from Illinois reported playing 2 specific games with her brother and 2 best friends. And I quote, "The first was My Side of the Mountain, based on a book we had read, and it involved gathering up food, which mostly ended up being grass and mud pies, which we pretended to eat, and then building our shelter because we were off in the woods without adult supervision. This was actually the backyard of our friends Kimmy and Ray. The other game we called Jimmy John, and it was about an astronaut that met up with all sorts of evil aliens that he had to defeat. Being the hero, Jimmy John was typically quite successful unless the alien happened to have some blue cheese in his possession, in which case Jimmy John was helpless, for blue cheese was akin to kryptonite for JJ, obviously. We also obsessively explored the ravines in the area, in which lurked all sorts of dangers, including wild animals and ill-intentioned recluses, which we had to outsmart in a series of never-ending adventures that we made up as we went," end quote. Again, it just shows how imaginative kids are. Jimmy Wim from East Lothian, Scotland reported this family-based game, and I quote, "A family thing we used to play with all my cousins when we had a big gathering at one of our aunties was the chocolate bar game. We'd all sit in a circle around a bar of chocolate, a big bar. Think of the ones that are the size of a headstone, and we pass a pair of big oven gloves around the circle like pass the parcel. When the music stopped, we had to put on the oven gloves, pick up a knife and fork, and try to cut ourselves a square of chocolate from the big bar," end quote. That one does sound quite cool, I must admit. I'm like, you had me at chocolate, to be fair. Helen from Sheffield reported a specific practice, which was less of a game, at her grandparents' house, and I quote, "Stepping on the landing, the crocodiles would get you, so you had to jump from the top of the stairs to the steps to the bottom, and then across to the steps to the bedroom," end quote. Which sounds like that would actually be quite difficult. Tracy from Illinois reported Easter egg hunts as being a big deal as a child, which could be indoors or outdoors depending on the weather, and the hunts also involved children receiving baskets containing, and I quote, "lots of candy and small presents, but only after all the eggs had been found," end quote. And she also reported specific 4th of July celebrations, and I quote, "The day started with a massive parade down the main street which went on for 2 to 3 hours. After that you would head to the park where there was a drum and bugle corps competition. Late in the afternoon was barbecue time at home, and then the anxious waiting for dusk to gather so we could go set up our blankets and picnics to wait for the fireworks, which usually started around 9 and went to about 11, end quote. It was interesting actually that Tracy was the only person who mentioned any seasonal things. So I wasn't quite sure why that was, but I thought it was worth including them. And while obviously the 4th of July celebrations aren't specifically games, I think there is enough of the seasonality to them that it was still worth including anyway. And obviously so far we have been looking at games, but we haven't really looked at playthings yet. And there were some pretty cool ones about sort of toys essentially. So Andy from Milton Keynes remembered, and I quote, a stick or branch from a tree being a sword / machine gun / lightsaber, end quote. And that was always the quite cool thing when you were little, that anything could be pressed into service as something else. Meanwhile, Chaz remembered this from London, and I quote, playing marbles and envying kids who had a giant silver-coloured marble which we called a bulbarian. Only much later as an adult did I realise it was a ball bearing, end quote. I remember reading that one when it first came in and thinking, that's amazing. That has to go in the episode. Ms from California reported a rather cool practice with a classmate named Blythe, and I quote, we had a belief in a pseudo Ouija board. You could write the alphabet in the dirt in this one, specific part in our playground, and the next day the wind / rain etc. would have erased letters. You could divine the future based on the letters that were left over, anagram style, end quote. So that one I thought was really interesting because it does tap into a couple of other divinatory practices. So I was like, that's quite interesting that they came up with that, but there is some precedent for things like that. So that was really cool. Rachel from Essex reported a rather specific belief from primary school from the early 2000s, and I quote, towards the end of this period, those gooey aliens in plastic eggs got popular. Everyone in the school believed that putting 2 in the same egg would create an alien baby, end quote. Again, children imaginations. Rachel also remembered, and I quote, things relating to material culture like scented gel pens, rubbers, plastic bracelets. Mainly these were about how many you owned and what the number represented, end quote. Meanwhile, Angela from Iowa reported that in the 1980s, and I quote, we played tarot with regular poker cards as true-false with odds and evens, end quote. And I mean, cartomancy with regular playing cards is absolutely a thing, and it's got actually quite a lot of antiquity to it. So that is quite an impressive thing that you were doing that in the 80s. Helen from Sheffield remembered playing Conkers, so an absolute classic in there. And she said, and I quote, there were strict rules about how you held the string and lots of things seen as cheating or not that led to endless rule discussions. Baking, vinegar, varnishing, etc. Wrapping the string round your hand to make it really short. The playground was covered in a layer of crushed conkers during conker season, which was lethal when it inevitably rained at some point and probably led to the banning of the game, along with injuries from being hit with conkers. I remember it being pretty painful when someone missed your conker and hit you, end quote. So it was quite nice to see conkers making an entry there. But Helen also remembered a strange game involving grass flowers aimed at other people. So you would pick a grass flower and you would hold it up and say, here's a tree in summer. Then you would pull the seeds off and hold out the empty stalk while saying, here's a tree in winter. You would hold it between your finger and thumb and go, here's a bunch of flowers. And then throw the seeds over the person, as you said, and there's the April showers, which seems a bit mean, really, but there we go. I just thought I'd include that one because I'd never heard that before. So if anyone's heard that as well, again, please feel free to let me know. And then I've also got a couple of occult adjacent games because I was quite pleased to see these pop up where they're not necessarily occult specifically, like using a Ouija board in the dust, but there's certainly some kind of occult nature in a way to them. So Alison from Romford remembered the levitation game, and I quote, a group of us would surround another child who would be lying down, and we'd repetitively chant, she looks sick, she looks sick, she looks pale, she looks pale, she is sick, she looks dead, and such like. And then each of us would put 2 fingers of each hand under the child lying down and levitate them by lifting them up. It was thought to be some kind of magic or something and a bit spooky / scary, end quote. And Tracy from Illinois also remembered playing light as a feather, stiff as a board, Bloody Mary, Ouija, Magic 8-Ball, and using the paper fortune tellers I showed you how to make in my first article about children's folklore. Tracy also reported quite a lovely personal practice rather than a game, and I quote, I personally had a ritual in which I would just go into the woods at the edge of my school playground during recess every day when the weather was decent and decorate this one large rock with flowers and moss and pretty leaves. I called it Beauty Rock, but it was clearly my first nature altar, end quote. So I quite liked that one, so I thought I'd put it in. Now obviously we've looked so far at quite a lot of games, and there's quite a specific branch of games where it's all involving clapping and skipping, so I thought I would put these ones separately because there were quite a lot of these reported, but these were the ones that were a little bit incomplete, so I wanted to make sure that I had more content, as it were, around those. So Harriet from London also reported, and I quote, my daughter, who is now 20, used to do lots of really complicated clapping games with her friends when she was about 5, saying, naughty little cat, you are very fat, You've got butter on your whiskers, naughty little cat, up, down, end quote. I can't even imagine what that looks like, but there was a much more extensive skipping game from Cheshire reported by Helen from Sheffield that's quite lengthy, but it seemed quite useful to include it just again to see if anyone's familiar with this one. But this one runs, and I quote, "When Susie was a baby Susie was, she went wah wah, wah wah wah," and then lots more wahs. "When Susie was a schoolgirl Susie was, and she went, miss, I can't do this, I've got my knickers in a twist. When Susie was a teenager she was, and she went, ooh, ah, I lost my bra, I left my knickers in my boyfriend's car. When Susie had a baby, his name was Tiny Tim, she put him in the bathtub to see if he could swim. He drank all the water, he ate a bar of soap, he tried to eat the bathtub but it wouldn't go down his throat. In came the doctor," and at this point a person jumps in. "In came the nurse," and another person jumps in. "In came the lady with the alligator purse," and another person jumps in. So then out went the doctor, so a person jumped out went the nurse, another person jumped out went the lady with the alligator purse, and then another person jumped out. And I can't work out if this is actually part of the same game or not, this is the problem. But it then goes on to say, "I had a little bumper car, number 48, went round the core," and at this point you leave the rope, run round and come back in the other side, "no," as in obviously corner, "and slammed on the brakes. And as they say brakes, you have to jump and land with one leg either side of the rope. The brakes went snap." And then she couldn't remember the next part before it then ends with "broke his back," end quote. So as I say, I don't know if those two bits about the bumper car and Susie's shenanigans, I suppose for want of a better word, are part of the same skipping game or if they're two separate ones. It was difficult to tell because they were sort of put in one block. So if you do know if they're two separate ones, again, feel free to let me know. And if you remember the one about the brakes going snap and you remember the bit that's missing, again, feel free to let me know and I'll update the written version in the blog post. Then finally, we've got some rhyming games, which obviously sort of fall under a similar idea as the skipping games, but obviously don't involve the skipping. Obviously, you may have heard the tic-tac-toe rhyme, and Alison from London updated it with the new version supplied by her 10-year-old, and I quote, "They now say tic-tac-toe, give me a high, give me a low, give me a 3 in a row, Bunny got hit by a UFO, landed on a marshmallow on the way to Tokyo," and it goes on and on from there. It would have been a favourite rhyme of her and her friends when they were about 7 or 8, so I imagine the rhyme has evolved further now, end quote. I had such a temptation to read that in the kind of style of the Beastie Boys. So yeah, you nearly ended up being treated to that. Helen from Sheffield recalled some playground chants used to decide who was first for something, most of which came from Great Sankey near Warrington, but one of the ones that she gave was certainly new to me, and this one runs, and I quote, "Ip dip dip, my blue ship, sailing on the water like a cup and saucer, OUT spells out, ip skip sky blue, it is not you," end quote. Now, we did a version of that with the ip dip, but we chose a word for animal feces that rhymes with ship instead. I'm sure you can guess what I mean by that. I don't like to swear on the podcast, otherwise I would actually say it, but I'm sure you can work out if it's ip dip dog. Yeah, you can work out what I was saying. Jen from Leeds also offered an additional verse to the Eeny Meeny rhyme from the 1960s that I'd never actually heard before, and this one runs, and I quote, "Eeny Meeny Miny Mo, put the baby on the paw, when it's done, wipe its bum, OUT spells out," end quote. So I'd never actually heard that one before. But what do we make of these childhood games? Well, I actually want to give the final word to Jimmy Wim from East Lothian because he gave a really interesting take on childhood games. So he said, and I quote, "There may be these collective memories of common widespread games, but our personal memories are probably a lot more individual and are shaped by the environment we played them in. More specifically, the layout and arrangement of the playground itself. We played bully on a patch of grass that wasn't too large, maybe 5 metres by 10 metres, on the side of the playground that joined the front to the back of the school. It made a perfect ring for the game, but with tarmac runoff we had to be pretty precise with our gameplay, otherwise it would lead to injury. Incidentally, I got this game banned from my school after I fractured my elbow during a bout." This particular memory theme carries on in another game that we used to play in a sectioned off part of the playground made for exclusive use by the Primary 7, which was the oldest year group. That was a really nice wooded area that was fenced in and featured an arched monkey bar climbing frame. We used to play a game in there that we called Hunt the C Word, aka Hunt the Gnome, when a teacher was in earshot. Basically hide and seek, except it was one kid versus the rest. The one kid would hide, everyone else would try to find them and beat them into submission, at which point they would give in and someone else would volunteer to be the norm and go away and hide. Again, this rather violent hide and seek variant has memories that are shaped by the environment it was played in. So a garden that had many trees, mostly birch or rowan, as well as many rhododendron shrubs, which offered many hiding places. But I wouldn't be surprised if this one versus all had variants all over the country, end quote. And I thought that was a really good way to look at a lot of these games. Obviously, quite a few of you did report similar versions of things or variations on similar games, like, for example, British Bulldogs or the What's the Time, Mr. Wolf one. And even some of the clapping and skipping games do seem really similar. Some of the practices that people reported, I remembered playing at school, or we had a variation on them. So I do think that there is a sense that the variations that exist would probably have been created due to either someone misremembering something or the fact that the arrangement of your playground or where you were playing them might have been what basically decided what you were doing. I remember all kinds of things where we didn't even necessarily play games on the field during break time. So there was a phrase towards the end of primary school where the girls would all get together and then sing songs from Grease, the musical, which I've never actually seen, and I hate musicals and always have. So I would invariably end up going and sitting by myself somewhere with a book because I was busy working my way through the classics, so like The Secret Garden and Black Beauty and things like that. But then we randomly also had a petanque set, so you could play petanque in this one little section of the field where it was, because it was in between like the two toilet blocks, it was just the right size for a petanque pit, I guess. How many schools did that? Probably not very many. I don't even know why we did, but it was a way to pass a break time. But it just goes to show, though, that we probably wouldn't have had the petanque set there if that hadn't been the arrangement of that particular part of the field. So again, as I say, it is quite interesting to see how these variations possibly are coloured by what we also remember of the school, what we also remember of what we were doing at home, because obviously some of these games were obviously played among family and friends as well, rather than at school. And I do think it's really cool to see the way that some of them have evolved. So, for example, like the updated tic-tac-toe one, I thought that was really cool to see how that one has then been taken by children and then just evolved and expanded. So it would be quite interesting to see how it's changed in about the last 2 or 3 years from the version that I had recorded. As I say, all of these different things have come from listeners or people who follow me on social media. So thank you very much to everybody who submitted anything across the last 3 episodes. It has been really useful, I think, to look at them. Obviously, there were some that I then came across in the games bit where there would suddenly be something to do with the pavement cracks or not picking dandelions were then in among the games bit, so I didn't see them until I came to do the game stuff. But there was quite a lot of the beliefs as well were kind of woven in there. So apologies if I didn't read your stuff out last week, but it was just because of the way that I'd sort of separated the spreadsheet up. I didn't actually see them until this week, so that's my bad, really. Sorry. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this detour into children's folklore. I've had quite a lot of comments from people going, oh my god, that's just jogged my memory so much. So I'm pleased that it's at least been helpful for like a memory lane kind of idea. And yeah, a lot of people have been quite fascinated by Quickie Town, which we had a look at last week, which I absolutely loved. So again, any updates on that will be marvellous. If you do want to add anything to any of the 3 episodes, like I say, you can leave a comment on the blog post, which is always linked in the show notes. If you're listening on Spotify or YouTube, you can just add comments straight away there and things like that. So there's plenty of places where you can leave comments, and then that means that we can essentially continue this conversation for weeks, months, whatever to come, as you remember things, or even as children in your life might tell you something new in the future. By all means, feel free to capture it for posterity, because this is the thing with folklore. If people don't write it down, it can then just disappear. So it is a way of capturing what's sometimes called like intangible culture, because it's obviously spoken a lot of the time where it's practiced, but it's obviously, if it's not recorded, it's basically intangible, so it would otherwise be lost, which would be sad. Next month, we're going to switch to trees, which are a perennial favourite, and obviously they're a favourite of mine. I've already got the first 2 trees. If you do have any requests, please let me know, but please do bear in mind that I have done trees quite a few times now, so things like ash, hawthorn, birch, hazel, oak, rowan, I've done all of those before, and there's not necessarily a huge amount to add to them. So if there's something specific that I haven't covered, please do feel free to let me know, and I'll see if I can pop them in as well. But anyway, This one obviously has been a lot longer, but that's just because of the fact that there was so much really interesting content and so many really cool games reported that I thought it was best to include all of them. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that. Thank you as always for your support. Thank you for anyone who's left a review of the podcast, because that obviously helps with algorithm nonsense. Thank you for anyone who's become a supporter on Patreon, Substack or Coffee. That does obviously help me to keep the podcast going. And anyway, I hope you have a marvellous week ahead, and I'll see you next week when we go to meet the London Plane Tree. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. I don't get paid per play of the podcast like musicians do, so if you'd like to support the podcast so I can keep it ad-free and help me pay for all the annoying stuff like web hosting and cover the hours it takes me to make these episodes, then you can buy me a coffee on Coffee or become a member of the Fabulous Folklore family by becoming a paid supporter on Coffee, Patreon and Substack. Or you can leave a review, tell a friend or share episodes on social media for free. It all helps.